Hey, Chris, this is Misha. I'm just giving you a 2-minute heads up that we're going to be starting. You too, Melissa.
I am watching the clock.
Okay, great. Perfect. You can hear me all right?
Perfectly.
Great. Thank you.
Misha, do you have anything you want to say as we get started, or do you want me to?
Nope, you go ahead and kick it off. Yep.
Okay, excellent. So,
welcome, everybody. If you want to get on video now, but yeah, you go ahead, Melissa.
Sounds good. So it's 1:30. We'll be punctual so that we can try to keep to a schedule and respect everyone's time. My name is Melissa Haltuck. I'm with the Northwest Fisheries Science Center Groundfish Stock Assessment Team, and I'm happy to welcome all of you to this Sablefish Management Strategy Evaluation Stakeholder Workshop. We really appreciate each of you taking time out of your busy day to join yet another online meeting. I will say that I prefer cameras on if possible, and I understand that not everyone may have the bandwidth to do so, but if you are willing to turn your camera on, please do so, and particularly when you are speaking. It's great to see people's faces. So I would like to note that we have participants from all regions across the Northeast Pacific that fish for sablefish or have an interest in sablefish, including the West Coast, British Columbia, and Alaska. And this meeting is really the result of a broad collaboration of people across these regions. And so while I'm the lead for the US West Coast, I would like to introduce my co-leads from the other regions, Carrie Fensky from the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, Carrie Wave, and Brendan Connors from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. The planning of this workshop and all of the work that you will see presented at this meeting today are really the product of a broad collaboration amongst a group of people that we've called ourselves the Pacific Sablefish Transboundary Assessment Team, and you'll hear a little bit about how we came to be later. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Pacific Fishery Management Council staff who have really facilitated this meeting and provided a large level of support in making this happen. It would not be possible without them. So before I provide you with a short presentation on how we've all ended up on this virtual meeting together, I would like to turn this over to Chris Kleinschmidt from the Pacific Council to give us a tech orientation so that everyone's familiar with the platform that we're using for this meeting. So Chris, take it away.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to orient you real quick with Ring Central and the controls that are within it. I'm sure many of you have already utilized this platform or Zoom or something similar. This is actually powered by a Zoom API, so it's extremely similar. But the main thing that we want to show you is the very first thing you should be doing is clicking the participant button at the bottom of your Ring Central interface. This is going to open up the pane to the right, which will give you access to the hand raise function. Once you've done that, you'll also be able to see who else is on the call, who's currently speaking. It gives you a visual indicator if you are muted or not. And then your unmute button is in the lower left-hand corner, should you want to toggle it that way. We certainly recommend using headsets when possible, just because they help with background noise and whatnot. But if you're in a quiet room and you've got a good setup, that's fine. Beyond that, we want to also point out that if you joined via a tablet or some other device, it may have joined you as iPhone or Samsung G2. If you hover over your name, you can rename yourself, and we would like you to rename yourself as P for participant if you signed it up as a participant, or O for observer, and then your name, and that will help us identify who is which, and we can also call on people appropriately. This meeting is also being live streamed via YouTube and recorded simultaneously. So we will be having those playbacks available via YouTube immediately after the wrap of each day, and then those are for the folks that just wanted to follow along and didn't want to participate. Up next is the basics for the controls. So moving from bottom left across, you've got your mute and unmute capabilities. The next button over is your start and stop videos. If you're sharing your webcam, many of you have already figured that one out. The participants button, again, there's a chat function. We ask that you utilize the chat primarily for getting technical assistance or someone's attention. We're trying to avoid having any conversations happen within the chat because it's supposed to be a dialogue forum where we have the discussion live. If you're a presenter, the share screen button will be your next option, and the details below on how to share your screen are listed out there. Currently, the share screen is disabled. We'll enable it right before each share screen. You just have to give the verbal notice. Like I said, this is being recorded. You can also record it locally, and that's what the record button will do. The leave button will obviously have you leave the meeting. If during the meeting you run into audio issues, maybe your bandwidth is a little low, things are starting to come in garbled, or you're having some other issues with maybe a headset that died and you need to switch, there's an up arrow down in the lower left-hand corner next to the microphone icon. This is where you're going to be able to select from different sources. So if you have multiple Bluetooth or headsets, or even speakers, both internal to your device or external, you can switch on the fly there, both for microphone and speaker. And then you'll notice that there's a test speaker and microphone option. Would recommend that you mute yourself first, because if you don't, everybody will hear you testing. But you can run that test and it'll identify if the system is picking up your devices properly. And then below that is the switch to phone audio. So that's a great option if you're having problems or you need to switch to telephone audio. You can do it on the fly within the meeting. You simply click that switch to phone audio button, and a dialog box will pop up with an option for call me. There's also an option that says phone call, but I prefer the call me feature. You type in the telephone number you want the system to dial you on. It automatically dials you. It plugs in all the pertinent information, and you're reconnected automatically without actually leaving the meeting. So that's the instructions on how you go about doing that. If you're using the web browser version, which our observers were permitted to do, it's essentially all the identical controls as what I just covered. We recommend Microsoft Edge or Google Chrome as your browser type. It seems to work the best for the web browser plugin. Just a reminder that the reason participants aren't supposed to use the web browser version is the web browser does not allow us to place you into a breakout room. So if you're a participant using a web browser, you need to get onto the download and install the actual application if you're going to be able to go into the breakout rooms a little bit later. And finally, some troubleshooting. Obviously these virtual meetings can take up a lot of bandwidth depending on your location. You may not have a lot to give. Some good troubleshooting things is turning off your webcam will save a little bit on your end. Switching from telephone audio versus computer will save a little more bandwidth. And then if you've got, Google Chrome open, and like some people who have 30 or 40 tabs open simultaneously, those all still eat bandwidth up even if you're not actively using them. So it's highly suggested that you close as many of those other web-based applications as you can if you're running into those bandwidth issues. And then finally, if you can hardwire or move closer to your wireless router, that'll also help in those instances. If you need any further technical issues, you can email me at chris.kleinschmidt@noaa.gov. Email is preferred because I'm running the meeting, so I won't be able to pick up the phone actively, but I can either coordinate with you via email or mute myself here and give you a call if you're having technical issues. So that pretty much covers the troubleshooting and basics of the RingCentral platform. I expect it'll all go smoothly, and you're all professionals at this point after a year of COVID. But if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thanks, Chris. Hopefully you won't have too many people pinging you. Okay, so I will share my screen and I'll give folks a short orientation to how we've all come together today.
1 second and I'll have you screen
Chris
share.
gives me permissions, yeah.
Yep. Go ahead.
So that we're all kind of starting in the same place. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So the goal here with this orientation is to give you a short introduction and kick off this workshop with some background for the PSTAT, and to give you some understanding of what led to all of us being here today, and to kind of convey the goals and purpose of gathering together today for this meeting. So I mentioned earlier that the Pacific Sablefish Transboundary Assessment Team is what this group of scientists that started working together has called ourselves. And we established the scientific collaboration between scientists from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, the Department of Fisheries Oceans Canada, and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to really think about how to develop a spatial management strategy evaluation framework for sablefish and to reinvestigate and movement models and the tagging data on a Northeast Pacific-wide basis. And you'll meet members of the PSTAT during other presentations in this workshop. So we started talking about sablefish collectively in 2016, and this is really motivated by a common concern regarding shared trends in spawning biomass and recruitment across all regions. And it was also, to some degree, highlighted in Pacific Fishery Management Council discussions with the SSC, where recommendations came out to develop a population model based on sablefish stock structure, and to think about what we needed to conduct Northeast Pacific-wide data analyses. And this is because sablefish is a straddling stock, and it's managed independently by the Pacific Council, DFO, and the North Pacific Council in the state of Alaska. And none of us really have a routine mechanism set for the exchange of information. And so we really tried to address this unfulfilled need to begin tracking and collaborating across regions, track what's happening across regions together. And so this is really kind of a bottom-up science-led effort to get a handle on sablefish population dynamics with a more holistic view. So we've made progress on research and data sharing, and as we've done that, we've expanded our discussions to the 2 U.S. Fishery Management Councils so that they are rolled into this work as well and aware of what we're doing. So the PSTAT focus is really on improving regional scientific advice and working to advise regional management with the best scientific information available. So we really want to think about how to evaluate potential bias in what we're doing currently due to the spatial mismatch between what we understand as the demographic population structure of Northeast Pacific sablefish and current management. And this really requires cooperation among regions. It is not our goal to manage the stock on a Northeast Pacific-wide basis. It's our goal to inform existing regional management processes. So this workshop is the first attempt at gathering together for an information gathering workshop designed to get the management strategy evaluation tool for sablefish up and running. So in some respects, you could think of this as MSE Lite. This is our first attempt at doing this, and we will certainly aim to start with a reasonable or manageable scope of work and then expand as we go. So a quick timeline of where we've come from. Again, we started talking in 2016, and we didn't really have any funding at that time. And because we are all mandated with fulfilling the needs of our existing management processes, we had to search for funding to support this work. And so in 2018, we obtained funding from the NIMS International Science Strategy to host our first transboundary research and data sharing meeting of the scientists. The product of this meeting was a report lead authored by Carrie Fensky and published in 2018 and is available on the website for this workshop. The PSTAT regional project leads then also obtained funding from Maya Kapoor, who's a PhD candidate at the UW, focusing on developing and implementing a Northeast Pacific Spatial Sablefish MSE framework, and for Luke Rogers, who was a postdoc at DFO and now has been hired to develop and implement a Northeast Pacific movement model using all of the available tagging data that we could dredge up across the region. So we hosted a second virtual meeting in 2020 that focused on outlining in more detail the MSE framework and thinking about a synthesis of environmental drivers of sablefish population dynamics. And here we are in 2021 at this phase one, what we're calling phase one workshop, our first outreach effort to solicit feedback on the MSE work to date and to direct where it will go in the future. And so a lot of this first phase is about building the MSE technical framework, getting a first cut at understanding the dynamics of sablefish and providing scientific advice to our respective managers. I expect that we'll learn as we go, and our target completion date for phase one is 2023, where we'll aim to have this MSE tool developed and tested with a limited set of management strategies, objectives, and performance metrics. Limited in some respects because Maya needs to graduate from her PhD. This is not meant to be a super long process for her. And then, of course, we'll disseminate results. And I expect once we've completed phase one, we'll know a lot more about the sorts of questions that will be useful to ask. We'll have more input from all of you. And we really are looking forward to getting feedback from all of you during this workshop about the things that you think are important with respect to Northeast Pacific sablefish and this MSE process. So a phase two or future MSE timeline will really be dependent upon the desire and needs that are identified during this phase one process and based on what we learn. The scope of this future work will certainly be influenced by this future workshop, as well as other outreach and communication efforts that we engage in. I expect at that point, we would be able to expand the range of management strategies that we can investigate. And of course, there's the typical disclaimer that phase two is dependent upon available resources, which really comes down to staff time and funding. So the intent for this workshop is to establish a collaborative, inclusive, and flexible process for stakeholders, managers, and scientists to continue the dialogue about sablefish. So we're broadening the scope from the initial PSTAT team to include more people. Items in this slide that are in bold are areas for particular feedback during this workshop. Because everyone has a different level of experiences with management strategy evaluation, we'll provide a general introduction and then overview of the successful management strategy evaluation process that has been ongoing in British Columbia for over a decade. We'll provide a presentation and dialogue on the Northeast Pacific Sablefish MSE operating model to date, where the structure is really focused around the spatial mismatch between the demographic population structure of sablefish and the Northeast Pacific management boundaries. And then we'll delve into more details with sessions tomorrow on fishery management objectives and performance metrics, and we'll go into more details about what those are in introductory presentations in those sessions. And then we'll also talk about proposed and future MSE management procedures and what may fall into the phase two category for research. So this is our charge for the next day and a half. And with that, I will ask for clarifying questions and stop sharing my screen. seem to have lost my Ring Central. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, and it looks like you're still sharing your screen.
I'm still sharing my screen. I've somehow managed to lose the Ring Central view of the world. Hang on.
Is it in that tiny toolbar again? Maybe.
Yeah, I think it got reduced. Now I see everyone, and this is right. Okay. Thank you, Maya. I'm looking at the wrong screen. Okay. So if anyone has anything they want to say or questions about why we're here and how we got here, now would be the time. Okay. So with that, I will introduce our facilitator for this meeting, Misha Key. Misha is a personal and professional development coach and facilitator and owner of Key Coaching and Development. She's an inspirational, heart-focused leader, helping individuals and organizations get from where they are to where they want to be. She has facilitated a variety of professional meetings, seminars, and workshops, supporting them successfully in achieving their goals. And prior to Misha becoming a coach and facilitator, she was a fisheries scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife for 16 years. So she really has a unique and diverse set of skills that combine both fisheries knowledge and leadership, and will do an outstanding job facilitating this meeting. So Misha, I'm going to hand this over to you so you can lay out the ground rules for this workshop.
Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. I really appreciate it. I'm so thrilled to be here. I've got you guys going on over here. And so I'm going to be, but I want to talk to you here. So anyway, I'm thrilled to be here with you today. Honored, actually. I remember when this was spoken of years ago, and I said, hey, I'll facilitate that one day for you. And then I ended up being a facilitator, and here I am. I'm super excited. And I hope you all are excited to be here as well. It's a great opportunity. Because, you know, this workshop is a workshop that has never existed before. This is our experience here together. And it's never been these people on this screen talking about this fishery together today. So I'm excited to work together and us working together respectfully, co-creating something really sweet. And this is a great workshop too, because this is not a decision-making workshop, and we know how those can be. So this should be quite simple, actually, just sharing information and ideas and talking about what's important to each of us. And we'll be capturing some valuable information there. So thank you for being here. My role is the facilitator, and I will be focusing mainly on the process. And, we all have roles here. Mine will be mainly on the process, keeping us on time, transitioning us, leading some discussions. Melissa and Carrie are the leads of this meeting, so you'll see us doing a lot of interacting with each other and bouncing things back and forth between the three of us and the rest of the team, the PSTAT, the IT people. So I thank everyone that's helped putting this together as well. So that is my role, is to facilitate through the process and to reach our outcomes, holding space for this to be a successful meeting. So introductions. I'm just curious about who else is in the room. So I want everybody to look around, because I don't know about you, but I've got to go to a different screen and a different screen and a different screen, and nobody has where are you people? Will you pop on your video if you can for a second? I want to see you. I want everybody to see each other. Can you do that for me? Here you go. I see you. Thank you. Wave to somebody you haven't seen. Hey, Brad. I see you waving. What's up?
Hi, Misha. Good to see you.
Hey, there's Stacy, Gary, a lot of people I don't know. There's still people with no cameras on, but that's okay. I just want you to take a peek around and see who's here. And actually, so for us to familiarize, like, who is literally here, we're going to take a quick poll. We're going to do quite a few of these throughout the next day and a half, just to, not be sitting and stuck in your chair. So Chris, if you'll put up that first poll, just so we can see who's in the room, if you will take that for us, let us know who's with us here today. Everybody should be able to see that on the screen. So let's just take a look. All right. It looks like it's kind of, nope, people are still doing. They're still moving. All right. So I think you can end that now, Chris. We have the scientists. Thank you for being here. The fishermen, fisherwomen, managers, NGOs. Who's other? If anybody's an other, do you want to tell us who you are? No? You don't have your camera on either? Or your mic?
Sandra from council staff says she picked other.
Okay. But there's more. There's two more of you.
Yeah, I'm Alexander Stubbs. I am a gear manufacturer, an academic, scientist, and a commercial fisherman.
Thank you very much for being here. Everybody's welcome. Who's that last lingering person?
It's me, Rob Cronland. I was formerly with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. I retired last fall. I'm now doing some consulting with the Canadian Sablefish Association.
Okay, great, Rob. Thanks for being here. And we're going to be hearing from Rob later today in just a little bit. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Yeah, actually, I'd put notes to myself to put it in the chat box, but I spotted you out anyway. Thank you. So now that we know who's in the room, Melissa's already described like how we're here, where we, how we got to here. Now we know who's here. And now let's, while we're here today. So I want to go over the outcomes. I'm going to share my screen. I think, let me go back over here. Did I share it? Can you see it?
Nope, not yet.
Okay. Let me do it again. Oh yeah, that's another thing I wanted to mention, technology. Don't get frustrated today with technology. Please.
We can see your screen now, your PowerPoint. If you want, you can change it to presentation view.
Okay, great. Thank you. Perfect. And I'm going to, can I ditch that poll, Chris? Is it saved?
You can go ahead and close it and everything will be saved on the back end. However, you need to disable presenter view because that's what you're broadcasting to folks is the notes side of it versus the opposite side of that.
What?
So see at the top where it says display settings?
Yeah.
Click that.
Uh-huh.
And then swap presenter view and slideshow.
Thank you. See, there you go. Thank you. All right, great. I appreciate that. So our desired outcomes are for, number one, stakeholders to increase the knowledge of sablefish science and management among regions. And this is not just stakeholders, this is everybody that's here. So just want to say that. So everybody that's here, we want to increase your knowledge about the science and management among regions, as well as the knowledge of the development of the Sablefish MSE tool. And then we're going to obtain feedback from all of you, the participants specifically in the breakout groups on inputs for phase 1, Sablefish MSE, and that is us going through the breakout groups of the objectives, performance metrics, and management procedures tomorrow. And then also at the end, we will be gathering information, and actually not just through the end, it's through this whole process. If there's things that come up that are kind of more phase 2, we will note it and we'll talk about it and put it in that phase 2 box. So we do want to gather information to support a possible phase 2 as well. So those are our outcomes for today. And to meet those, we have to have some ground rules and agreements. Number one is everybody participates and no one dominates. Some of you know who you are. Some of you don't know who you are. But in today, we would love for you to, sometimes the worst meetings is either you have somebody dominating or no one speaks at all. So, try something different today. If you're a person that speaks a lot, you maybe sit back and listen a little bit. And if you're one of those that don't speak up, today's your chance. Do something different and speak up today and tomorrow, of course. We want to hear from all of you. One person speaks at a time. We'll do the best we can here. Just be respectful of people speaking, and we'll go through raise the hands and all of that. But one person speaks at a time. Get all your distractions away, cell phones, other devices, to the best of your ability. We know that many of you are sitting at home. Do the best you can getting those distractions out of the way. We ask that you be on mute when you're not speaking at all times. And Melissa already mentioned, we'd prefer you to have your video on, definitely, especially when you're speaking, as long as that's possible for you, turning your video on. And we're going to do some raising of the hands. If you have a question, raise your hand, wait to be acknowledged, and be patient. There's a lot of you on here. And as we mentioned, there's participants and observers here. So we will be focusing a lot on the participants because they will be in the breakout groups. And yet we will be touching in on to getting some feedback on some observers too. But our main focus will be on the participants' feedback in the breakout groups and stuff. So looking forward to that. And then have fun the best we can, staring at a computer. I hope we have some fun here today. And just so you know, these agreements, ground rules, these will also hold true in our breakout groups. So I don't know, can you do like thumbs up or something that these are good? Everybody agreeing. I can't see everybody, unfortunately, but I'm hoping everybody's given a thumbs up on those so we can reach the outcomes for this meeting, for this workshop while we're here. So thank you. So let's go through the agenda. So this is what we've already done today. Woohoo! Welcome, roles, intros, agreements. And so now we're on the agenda. And then after this, we are going to be going through session 2 and having an introduction to management strategy evaluation and stakeholder engagement. Melissa will be presenting first on just the introduction to management strategy evaluation and the engagement of the stakeholders here. All of you this is what the workshop's about. And then we'll go in and then we will listen from Rob. We'll be listening to him on the BC experience. They'll tell a little bit of their history and their lessons learned through their MSE process, a stakeholder involvement process and their success. Then we'll have a break, and then we will come back and we will listen to Maya talk about the introduction to the Northeast Pacific Sablefish operating model and listen to her presentation and have a discussion, and then we'll be done for the day. So that's where we're going. Oh, and then tomorrow, I think I did too. Yeah. And then tomorrow is going to be a packed day of breakout groups, looking at the objectives, performance metrics, and MSC management strategies, and talking about phase 2. So tomorrow will be a full day of breakout groups, presentations, breakout groups, and discussion. So tomorrow's going to be a full day. That's for sure. So with that, I think that's all I need to do there with the agenda. Oh, I know. No, it's not. One more. We want to know how you're feeling today. So, Chris, can you throw up another poll for us? Can you just tell us currently, right now, how are you feeling today? Let's see. Let's just get a temperature check of the room. I like to check people's energy, especially it's challenging online. I love it. Curiosity. I love it. You're in a good place. All right. Are they still coming in? I'm scared to ask the others on this one. I'm just going to leave that one be on this one, I think. So you can end that polling. I'm glad that there's a lot of curiosity in the room because that's where a lot of learning happens. So I'm really excited. So before we go into session 2, I think I've covered everything right now. If there's any questions, I'm open for that first. Are there any questions? And help me hand raise. I think John, you're helping me with raised hands and.
Yeah, and there are no raised hands.
Great. Then that means it's pretty clear. That's good. So before we step into session 2, shake out your bodies. Yeah, I see you, Jane. Jane's the only one shaking. I see your head shaking, Andre Punt. You're about to sit through two presentations. Well, you sit all day anyway, Andre.
I started at 2 a.m. already.
So anyway, all right, if you don't want to get up, that's fine. You'll regret it. But we're going to move into section 2. Uh-oh. Chris?
Yes.
Never mind. I got it. That's good news. Yeah, I had to buy a new computer this week to make all of this happen and relocate and get out of the mountains. So I'm a little technically challenged. Anyway, okay, so now we're going to move into session 2. We are going to, so the rest of this afternoon is informational. We are going to first listen. Informational. Melissa. Introduction to the MSE strategy evaluation. The objective is really to understand the basic premise, goals, and utility of an MSE and your roles in your role in the process. And this is an iterative process with your input incorporated based on multiple time horizons. This is for the 2-year, 2-year deal, Maya's PhD work, but we are going to. Yes, hold on. Yes, I'm getting confused. I'm thinking Maya's coming up and she's not. Okay, Melissa's going to give us an introduction and let me introduce her. Melissa works for the Groundfish Stock Assessment Team at NOAA Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle and is an affiliate faculty member at the University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fisheries Science. She worked on the West Coast Sablefish Stock Assessment during 2015. And after which she recognized the need to think beyond regional boundaries to effectively understand sablefish stock dynamics. She enjoys building and leading collaborative research teams to investigate interesting and management relevant fisheries issues, which has led us to this workshop today. So we thank you for all of your curiosity and dedication to the sablefish fishery, Melissa. So go ahead and get set up. Yay.
Thank you, Misha. I will.
You're welcome. And I'd like to, I want to just remind the note takers, Carrie and Brendan, for the session, John, chat box watcher, and Melissa, I'll just give you a 5 minutes heads up around that time, and go for it. It's all yours.
Good. So I recognize that this talk is probably pretty elementary for some of you in the room and probably completely new for others. And the goal here is really to kind of try to level the playing field so everyone's starting with the same basic understanding. So Misha, thank you for that introduction and stating the goal of this workshop. we'll dive right in. And really, we wanted to give you an overview of what is management strategy evaluation. And it really is a structured process that allows us to investigate what-if questions. And those what-if questions can vary quite a bit, from data collections to scientific models to how we make our catch decisions. And as Misha said, this is generally an iterative process, not a one-off single project. And in addition to being iterative, I would suggest that it's non-linear, even though the workshop is structured in a somewhat linear fashion. I expect that as we go forward in time, we'll revisit components of this workshop as people have interest and need. So the kinds of what-if questions that we can address include, what if we make changes in data collections, assessment methods, quota setting, we change how we do spatial management, or what control rules we apply to set our catches. And we want to use MSE to assess the robustness of the management procedure to uncertainty by using scenarios. And you could think of a wide array of uncertainties that you might want to address in a management strategy evaluation framework. Those can include the kinds of data you use or the observation error around those data, the kinds of scientific models you use to estimate the stock size and status of your population, and whether or not those models are misspecified with respect to space or environmental impacts on the stock or productivity, such as growth and recruitment. You could also investigate the uncertainty around management implementation and the attainment of catches. And this is really a simulation framework to evaluate the trade-offs in achieving alternative management procedures and to assess the consequences of uncertainty in achieving management goals. And someone in this meeting wrote that, and as I am a graduate of Andre's, I guess I'm obligated to put a quote by him into my slides. So what is MSE? Well, it's an analysis tool to simulate the workings of a fishery and test whether the existing or proposed management procedures are or can achieve specified management goals. And so no MSE talk would be complete without a flow chart. And so I'll address the technical tool first, which is the operating model. We'll talk more in detail about the operating model in session 3, but essentially this is the simulated framework that is the best representation of the sablefish stock dynamics that we can build given the data and the knowledge that we have. And we use this operating model to simulate a fish population, to sample that fish population, and then to produce observed data. Those data then feed into a management procedure. We will talk about management procedures in session 6, but essentially the management procedure in aggregate is the data that goes into the stock assessment that is then a harvest control rules applied to the results of that stock assessment, which triggers some management action and catch setting and fishery regulations. And then there's feedback between that management procedure and the operating model, so that as you move forward in time, you cycle through the operating model and the true state of the population being impacted by the catch and regulatory decisions made in the management procedure. So this is really the technical tool that Maya has been working so hard to build. So there is another set of boxes in this flow chart. These are these green boxes where we want participants in this workshop to inform the process. So these are our areas of particular focus. The first are, what are your management objectives? What do you care about for your fishery? And what do you want the management procedure to achieve? And so this is what we'll talk about in session 4 tomorrow. And then once you have your objectives, you need to measure whether or not you're meeting your management objectives. And so these are called performance metrics. We will talk about performance metrics in session 5. So these are 2 core areas for participant input. We also have room for participant input, for example, into the harvest control rule within the management procedure. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in session 6 as well. So once you have performance metrics identified ahead of time, you can calculate the true performance metrics from the operating model, which really represents the true state of the system as best we can represent it. And then you can compare those performance metrics with the same metrics calculated from the management procedure. So these are essentially the estimated performance metrics. And this comparison lets you evaluate whether or not your management procedure is attaining your management objectives. So we want to take a minute to introduce some common language for this work because we all come from different regions and different experiences, and the terms do matter. So in your background materials online, there's a glossary, and I expect that this will be a bit of a living document as we go forward in time. But we wanted to distinguish between the terms management strategy evaluation and management procedure with strategy in parentheses, because I think that this could potentially be a bit confusing. So management strategy evaluation is the combination of the technical tool and the consultative process that I outlined in the previous slide. The management procedure, also in some literature or other fora called management strategy, is the combination of a pre-agreed data, specific analyses applied to those data, and a harvest control rule used to determine management measures based on the results of those analyses. And the management procedure is designed to achieve fishery objectives. Okay, so try to distinguish between the high-level MSE process and the management procedure, which is really, these are the steps that lead us to how we set our catches or set our management measures. So to take a quick look, I think it's worth taking a quick look at what our current regional management procedures look like and just the flow of information that goes through these. So in Canada, scientists conduct a survey and a simplified stock assessment model, and then apply a harvest control rule to provide harvest advice to an advisory body. That advisory body recommends a total allowable catch to fishery managers, and the fishery managers then set that total allowable catch or other management regulations. And so in Canada, this is an annual process, and this annual process with the survey data and the simplified stock assessment is supported by a full stock assessment and management strategy evaluation to identify the preferred management procedure to apply annually. And that full stock assessment in MSE takes place every 3 to 5 years. And you'll hear more about this from Doctors Rob Carland and Sean Cox next.
Melissa, Andre has his hand up.
Okay. Andre?
Yeah, I mean, Melissa, I guess this could come later, but there is, and I'm sure you're going to pick it up, the difference between the reason we use those different words is in Canada, as you've identified, the process is somewhat automatic. In the US, we can't really have management procedures as they defined in Canada or say in these international organizations, because we have things like SSCs. So you can't have a pre-agreed assessment because the assessment depends on what, say, a star panel says. So that was where the terminology strategy versus procedure comes from. So in the US, we really don't have management procedures as they're formally defined in the literature. I'm sure Rob and Sean will praise the fact that Canada can do it, but we in the US can't simply because of the Magnuson Act National Standard 2. Hence the term strategy versus procedure. We'll be testing strategies in this project, we'll be testing, procedures as if they were strategies. This is not very helpful.
Correct. Well, yeah, I mean, this is kind of an academic segue. So we can, someday when we can all gather together and have a beverage, we can discuss this further.
We've been talking about for this particular topic for 25 years, I'll have you know.
Yeah, I know. That's why I quoted you. Anyways, Andre is alluding to this, that we have a different process in the US. which is subject to mandated levels of scientific review. So on the US side, scientists conduct the stock assessment, and then there's a level 1 science review in which the scientific advice is produced out of that review, and we calculate allowable biological catches and overfishing levels. And then there's a level 2 science review that must be passed, which is by the Science and Statistical Council committees of the councils that endorses that scientific advice. At the same time, there is advisory body input into this process, both at the level 1 and level 2 science reviews. And those advisory bodies represent both fishery managers and industry representatives. And they will produce their advice for a recommended total allowable catch. And both of these products go to the Fishery Management Council, which then set total allowable catches and other management regulations. And depending on the region in which you reside, this may happen on an annual cycle or a multi-year cycle for assessment and management.
Melissa, Sean Cox has his hand up.
Go for it, Sean.
Hi, Melissa. Yeah, I'm curious about that advisory bodies recommending a TAC. What do they? So they're using their interpretation of the stock assessment to recommend a TAC. Where are they getting that from?
The stock assessment produces what we call a decision table, which applies a range of alternative catches across both the base model identified for management and a range of states of nature. And so there's effectively a range of different catch decisions that could be chosen out of that stock assessment. And so they are like the GMT and GAP representatives, the managers and the industry folks are both at the level 1 scientific review at the table. They are also present and can make public comment at the level 2 science review if they wish.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else? Okay, it's good to see us building our common understanding of each other's processes. So this analogy has been used in many other management strategy evaluation talks, and we'll use it again here, which is, another look at why MSE, and MSE is a flight simulator. And so essentially, this is a simulation tool to identify management procedures and to think about the fact that a management procedure that fails in a simulation is really unlikely to work in the real world. And that it's better to find out what does not work on a simulator rather than to crash the plane. And in our case, that's we don't want to collapse the stock or cause long-term socioeconomic or ecological harm. So we prefer to use simulation to test management procedures to identify what's likely to work and what does not. So simulation improves your chance of success. It does not guarantee that you will never crash, but it does provide you with a better chance of success. Essentially, the better the simulator, the operating model, the better the pilot, which would be the management procedure. So here are the goals: to identify management procedures robust to uncertainties, and those uncertainties can encompass environmental considerations, data collections, model configurations, or management implementation. And you want management procedures that meet your management objectives as measured by the performance metrics that you've chosen to measure them. So the operating model is a fisheries simulator, and I'll leave this slide with a quote by Doug Butterworth, who is one of the earliest adopters or developers of this MSE framework, which suggests that MSE is analogous to an autopilot with the associated advantages. However, it does not mean that the aircraft should be left without a pilot, and the pilot must remain on board to look out for the unexpected major course deviations that may not have been factored into the design, including appreciable changes in the scientific perceptions concerning the resource. So how is MSE useful to us as a group? Well, it's a mechanism for measuring trade-offs and meeting management objectives between alternate management procedures that uses simulations and tests outcomes via performance metrics. It's a tool that enables transparency with respect to the potential sustainability of management procedures and fishery objectives. And the MSE process can help identify where we have information needs and opportunities to improve information for future decisions. So many other fisheries have had positive experiences with their fisheries and producing improved results for both fish stocks, fishers, and communities. There are challenges in that in some instances, the consultative process has been long, and that MSE won't necessarily fix or solve allocation issues or fishing capacity issues or that kind of thing. So for Northeast Pacific Sablefish, this workshop is really informing what we're calling phase one, which is Maya's PhD work. And we're focusing on the big picture sources of scientific uncertainty for sablefish. Stock assessments often have noisy data or data that are not representative of the true population. And often the stock assessment and thus management advice could be ignored or poorly represented spatially. We may have misparameterized spatial biological parameters or ignore and misrepresent movement and environmental conditions. And I think one of the key things here for me is that we have all been largely ignoring or misrepresenting movement in how we conduct our stock assessments. So there's, with respect to the modeling process, and this is essentially why the PSTAT group was formed in the first place, which is to step back and take a big picture view of sablefish data and population dynamics, and to think about how we can make improvements in our scientific advice to managers for each region. So we expect this to take about 2 years, and we expect Maya will finish her dissertation. And at the end, which is just kind of a step along the way, we really would like to think about how we can build more biologically accurate models to result in improved scientific advice to managers as the basis for decision-making. And we're building this decision support tool so that it will aid in identifying management procedures that are expected to provide acceptable results to the regions. And we'll start these discussions in depth tomorrow, right? And so what specifically are we asking from participants at this meeting? Well, first of all, we want to know what you want. Specifically with respect to what are your goals for the fishery, with respect to catches or the size of the fish or the fishing seasons. What are your performance metrics that you're interested in, i.e. how are your fisheries goals to be evaluated? These are the basis for comparing across different management procedures. And then we'll talk about management procedures and what kinds of considerations we may include in those as we move forward. So with that, I'll leave it open for clarifying questions.
Andre has his hand up.
Yes, Andre.
I think I'm already failing Misha's talk too much rule. But I think one really important consideration to place the whole thing in context is going back one slide and recognizing that this effort is, you called it phase one, but I think it's phase one of 3 or 4. Ultimately, what we are not, or what I think we're not dealing with are non-sablefish considerations. So you've already talked about objectives related to allocation are sort of not within the scope of this. And I'm presuming there are other such things, for example, ecosystem health, the value of sablefish to whales. There's a whole bunch of ecosystem objectives that people might have that I think are in phase 3 or phase 4. So it'd be helpful as we get to this to put some, what are the sideboards for phases 1 and 2? Not ignoring the fact that other objectives are important, but I don't, for example, expect that you'll be creating economic performance metrics in this MSE. Not that it could be done, but it won't be done. So I think it would help us to, and maybe this will come up tomorrow, to know what the technical sideboards are, to avoid discussion that rapidly ends up in a place where you can't perform, basically.
Right, and we'll lay this out in the future just as we step through the discussions. And yes, we want to hear what people care about, right? And we will recognize those points as for future work. In this state, you're right, we don't have tools built or in the process of being built for economics, for example, or ecosystem considerations. But really this first cut is the aim to support building the basic technological tool, the basic technical tool to run the MSE, and to be able to answer some really low-lying fruit questions with respect to, you know, how do our regional management processes look when you start to consider sablefish on a range-wide basis, right? And so we're really focused on spatial misspecification within our management procedures and how that impacts the advice we give. The other items that you mentioned will certainly be discussed in the report of this meeting as items for future work, and we want to know about those because that will help us prioritize that future work. Any other questions?
There are no hands raised, Melissa.
Okay, so I will stop sharing my screen and I can see all of you for the moment. And so now we'll segue into the presentation by Drs. Rob Crowlin and Sean Cox on the BC MSE experience. And so as a brief introduction, Dr. Rob Crowlin served as the DFO Sablefish Program Head from 2002 to 2017 at Pacific Biological Station in Nanaimo, where he collaborated with staff in the Sablefish program. Rob spent his last few years with DFO, 2017 through 2020, working on fisheries science policy interactions related to the Canadian Fisheries Act at their headquarters in Ottawa. And Dr. Sean Cox is a professor at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia and works with the regional groundfish managers and the sablefish industry to develop and implement the MSE approach for British Columbia sablefish. And so I'm really thrilled to have them here. I think that we can all learn a lot from their experience, and I will pass the torch to them so that they can tell us about the BC Sablefish MSE.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm Rob Cronland, and I'm going to be presenting today. Not really. This is Sean. Rob, I don't know if he wants to show his face or something so people know what he looks like and know who to blame for all the things that I get wrong here in the talk.
Afternoon, everybody.
Okay. Let's see here. So yeah, thanks. And thanks for inviting us. And, you know, we've recognized for a long time that BC sablefish are just part of a larger coastwide population. And we you know, every year when we go through the TAC setting processes, you know, we always look at the results of and this is mainly due to Rob, who kind of started this, and we've since kept it up while he was gone. But, you know, looking at the Gulf of Alaska assessment and then their resulting TACs and looking at the Lower 48 assessment, just to kind of keep a pulse on what's going on elsewhere and making sure that we're not totally off base on what our models are saying. And so we started, and I'm basically give you an overview of the MSE process that we started back in 2006. But, you know, over those years, we've always wondered, you know, okay, so what happens if, you know, the Gulf keeps their quota at, you know, 21,000 tons like it used to be? Or, you know, it goes up or down, and how is that affecting us? So that, you know, that's our main interest in this kind of process, is to answer some of those questions that we've never really been able to tackle yet. But what I'll talk about now is just give you an overview of, the marching orders we got for this presentation from Brendan, where, how did it start? What is the main process, and what are some of the key lessons learned? So it's been a very long, very detailed process, agonizing at times. I'm going to skip all that. So this is going to look fairly polished, like things always, went really smoothly and have gone well from the beginning. But there have been critical moments where it didn't look like it was going to actually happen, and so a little bit of survivorship bias here, maybe in the presentation, but we can talk about that later. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so as a quick overview, back in 2005, Steve Martell and I did a review that Rob had invited us to do of the Sablefish Science program, and specifically looking at the science because it appeared that there was a problem in the science. And when we went through that, one of our main recommendations from that was to make a transition from a tactical best assessment approach, very similar to what Melissa described in terms of the US approach, to a strategic MSE approach. And it took about a 5-year transition period from the time, that recommendation until sablefish quotas were actually being set annually using simulation tested management procedures. We, of course, everything that you've described, Melissa's described as far as, phase one here and setting up the foundation for an MSE. We went through that and have iterated on it since, but that kind of took us over about a 5-year period. Currently, the MSE components, from everything from objectives to procedures and operating models, are revised and retested on a 3-year cycle. We usually spend about a year working on updating the operating model and things like that, and then 3 years of just applying the management procedure and calculating a quota. It's a very simple system. And some of the things that have come out of this, number one, the most important thing that stakeholders in particular are really happy about is it provides a scientifically defensible way to address objectives and uncertainties. Scientific defensibility has been kind of a keyword for several years now, and so I'll talk about that later on. It engages everyone from science, management, policy, as well as stakeholders. Everybody's got input to the process. And another key thing is that there's evidence that the management system is precautionary, both in theory and in practice, and also, as Melissa pointed out, probably in practice. You can never guarantee it, but you can certainly increase the probability of it being precautionary, and that's a big deal in Canada these days. It provides a key transparency from the data that's collected to the decisions that are made, and I'll touch on that later. And also for industry, they're able to actually evaluate investment choices and other strategic issues. So when things started back in 2005, DFO and the Canadian Sablefish Association were involved in a co-management type agreement where they were sharing responsibility for managing the fishery, and the industry was essentially paying for the monitoring of the fishery. They were paying for conducting the survey every year, collecting biological data. They had a couple of, at least one, or Rob can correct me, 1.5 person years that they funded basically to work on their data issues in DFO. But in 2005, it was more of a conflict situation because things weren't going that well. As of 2001, they had the lowest survey index ever, and that's highlighted in that graph there. on that by that red circle, it created somewhat of a panic by industry, and this is soon after the Canadian cod collapse. So they at the time were thinking, "Good God, we're the next cod," and we've collapsed the stock. So it was a bit of a panic at that point. As part of the review that Steve and I did, we noticed there had been 17 stock assessment models in the previous 18 years. So basically every year, there was some new version of a stock assessment model. And there was no explicit science advice being provided to managers on TACs. So also similar to the US system, there were decision tables being put out under different model scenarios and things like that, but there was nothing to actually that managers could use directly. One of the reasons for that was the lack of management objectives that was pointed out in several assessments. There was also a mismatch between science and stakeholder perceptions of fish on the grounds, because the fishery, where it fishes, it tends to run into younger fish fairly soon. And the science doesn't really see that because the age composition doesn't reflect it for a few years. The survey indices take a few years to actually track new cohorts. So the fishery was running into a lot of fish, but the science was not actually updating the TACs the way they'd hoped. Another factor is that decisions were not really reproducible, that there was not a repeatable management procedure. And this is one of those things that follows from things like decision tables, is that they're not reproducible. They may be in practice reproducible, but in theory, they're probably not that reproducible. And so these kinds of things led to an adversarial relationship between science, stakeholders, and management at the time. So in a nutshell, the stakeholders were asking at that time for transparent decision rules for setting TACs. And that's really all they wanted. They wanted a clearer path from the data that they were collecting to the TACs that were being set. And the managers just wanted science to tell them what the sustainable TAC should be. It was in every request for science advice. There was a bullet asking for the sustainable TAC or optimal yields, things to that nature. But of course, science objected because nobody was giving them objectives. So they refused to provide that specific advice. So this is just a little graphic. You'll see this graph several times. This is one half of the management procedure that we use every year to set the TAC. And I'm just highlighting here that from about 1990 to around 2005, this was the period where the stock assessment models were being fit every year, and decision tables were being used to set TACs. The data that were being used were the gray circles were the fishery CPUE, the open circles were what's called a standardized survey, and then the dark circles are a stratified random survey. Issues in every one of those has issues, the stratified random survey having the least among them. The commercial CPUE and the standardized survey were both questionable kind of data series that eventually were phased out. But this just highlights graphically that there was a bit of a transition period, and then basically we've been in this MSE process for that time. So I don't want to totally repeat things that Melissa said, but just to give you an idea, like these are the kinds of messages and graphics and definitions that we've been using on the Canadian side for the past however many years that we've been doing this. And we've been trying to keep it as simple and clear as possible and consistent. So what we're calling a management strategy is that little cartoon on the left, and it involves everything from the goals and objectives, the management procedure, the way it's evaluated. Of course, there's operating models buried in that evaluation step, and the application and monitoring of performance. So this is our kind of view of what the strategy is, and then the management procedure is a specific component of that. This kind of process is scientific. It's scientific, it's repeatable, provides high quality advice. It's adaptive in a lot of ways to uncertainty and change, and all the other things that people have pointed out about the MSE process. Again, not to repeat what Melissa said, but here's just this is quite similar, actually almost identical, except inverted vertically or something. But we have an operating model on the left where our operating models assume the stock is closed, that it's not influenced at least directly or in a tractable way from outside Canada. Sampling error and data are generated from that operating model. So we have survey indices and landings are the main data that are part of our management procedure. We don't use age composition in the management procedure. It's just that picture that I showed you initially. There's those 3 survey indices and the fishery landings. We also don't include fishery discards in that procedure either. And then there's a fairly straightforward state-space model, just a production model, keeps track of biomass, one metric of biomass over time. And then that gets information gets passed through a harvest control rule that adjusts the target harvest rate depending on the stock status, and that sets the catch limit. And then this catch limit, as I'll show you later on, that becomes the advice, and that actually is what gets implemented. So it's pretty close to a kind of clockwork type of a system. The scientific defensibility comes in where, just like in science, where you're trying to reject hypotheses. Well, here we reject management procedures that don't even work in theory. And so here, as Melissa also said earlier, like if it doesn't work in computer simulations, it's very likely not going to work in practice. So we use this mainly as a filtering step to eliminate procedures that are unlikely to work. So getting back to what started the whole process back in 2005, the conflicts, one of the main ones was, of course, that there was no repeatable management procedure. And so a lot of these issues arose, around the components of the procedure. So the data in particular were, as I can show you again later, but if you recall that one of the surveys was highly variable. It was actually precise within a season, but it changed a lot from year to year. It had a lot of interannual variability to it, and it was possibly biased. The fishery CPUE also has possible biases in it. The assessments, there were too many assessments. They were coming too frequently and changing too often. And of course, there was no apparent repeatable decision rule. So it was really a crapshoot as to what was going to happen from one year to the next. The other main issue, of course, was that there were no clear management objectives. I mean, every country has vague notions of sustainable fisheries management, but there was no real hard and fast guidance on what was meant by precautionary. This actually came out in 2006. DFO published its precautionary framework, which we drew on quite heavily later on when it came to establishing objectives. And then the sustainable fisheries framework that followed have really helped us a lot in setting fishery objectives. So looking at the management procedure, kind of what was the decision rule at the time? So one of the things we did, we looked at the relationship between historical biomass as estimated by the 2005 assessment and the historical TACs that were being set. And so we got this relationship here. And we forced a Beaverton Holt curve through it. And we said, all right, well, this looks kind of like a possible harvest control rule. And this could actually be used to make repeatable decisions. And so then the question is, well, should you? Is this something that would meet Canada's precautionary harvest strategies and the precautionary approach? And would it provide pretty good stable yield at a profitable CPUE, which is what the industry was really interested in? So I'll just point out here, if you look at that cluster of points, the average up there is somewhere just above 4,000 metric tons. It's about 4,200 metric tons. What ended up happening when early on, like in the transition period from 2005 to 2010, we did a lot of modeling, even though the industry told us they didn't want any models. We did it anyway, and we found very early on that this was a really bad harvest control rule. Even though it's repeatable, even though it's explicit, and you can repeat this as you want, the fishery would fail if you did this. And the main reason being that average there, like this is taking the quotas well above 4,000 tons quite often. And if you look at the MSY estimate from all of the operating models that we did, none of them would support catches that high. The actual MSY for what we get are anywhere from 22 to 3,200 tons, depending on the operating model. So there's no indication that this fishery could have supported catches like that in the long term. And this is why the transition period took 5 years, because we had to convince a lot of stakeholders, a lot of industry people that this was actually the case, right? That yes, the historical data showed you could take 4,200 tons quite often, but if you look back at the data, the stock was not doing very well over the past 10 years. So there was a lot of risk embedded in what was going on at the time. So a lot of that 5-year transition period was, educating stakeholders on the fundamentals of fishery science, really. So it was one of the reasons for that. The other major issue, as I mentioned, was the objectives. And so we needed these fairly early. And I've seen this in several MSE processes where, the first thing that people do is sit down and say, okay, well, what are your objectives? And that turns out to be one of the hardest things to do, because stakeholders really have no idea what to even think about what they want. If they don't back in 2005, you asked stakeholders what they want. Well, most of them said, we want quotas at 4,500 tons, which was totally unrealistic. So it took over those 5 years of showing them that you can't have 4,500 tons unless things go really well. There could be, instances where that happens, but definitely not on average. It shouldn't be something that one would expect. So, setting objectives is really difficult. One of the things that we did was derived all of the conservation objectives, really. We derived those from national policy, and I'll show you those in a minute. Keeping the objectives small, we've had anywhere from 4 or 5 objectives in this whole MSE process. Avoiding multiple objectives that tend to measure the same thing, where you can tend to overweight certain objectives. And then something that isn't really mentioned in any really of the MSE literature is something from the structured decision-making framework or ideas, where they talk about what's called a decision context. It's actually probably what we're doing right now. well, it's actually not, but the decision context is deciding at the beginning how objectives, for example, will be used to reject management procedures. Basically establishing, how are decisions going to be made when these management procedures all get tested and then come around to be implemented. I've been involved in fact, with Sablefish, we've done other projects, smaller MSE projects where we've done a lot of work and everybody thought we had found a solution, but we actually neglected the decision context, and turns out that there were governance issues that got in the way of implementing certain strategies to protect coral habitat. So,
excuse me,
that's
Sean.
another story.
Andre has his hand up.
Okay.
Hey, Sean. A question back on the previous slide, particularly for the US folks. Canada, of course, has a Minister of Fisheries, which we don't. I guess the question for, you sort of say this was a pretty awful strategy. To what extent was there any, even our harvest control rules, as you have noticed, have got some, there's some flexibility in them, but there's also the constraint of the OFL control rule. You can never exceed the OFL. And I gather in Canada, the minister, the rule is the minister decides all. So is it fair to say there really wasn't a harvest control rule that led to this de facto harvest control rule? Or was there actually some control rule underlying all of this, and it's just scientific error that you're seeing these results? I find this very interesting because obviously a concave control rule violates everything we know about precautionary management.
Yeah. Well, the minister does have ultimate authority. There was no harvest control rule that I know of that was, and Rob could correct me, that was being applied. These were decision tables. And I don't know, going back to 1990, what was, at least up until the mid 90s, it was fairly crude way of setting these T. You can see like 1990, 91, 92, those are probably set based on some guesswork, I would imagine. But as time went on, it went more into the decision table approach, where it was, quotas down one column, and then, probability of certain things happening, going across the columns, and then repeating those tables under different assumptions about recruitment, about average recruitment, and things like that. And from that, it was, it was literally, I sat in on some of these debates, and it was literally, who yelled the loudest about where the quotas were set. And just quickly show you. So if you look right in there at the left side of that transition period, you can see where the quota went from its lowest pretty much over the past several decades, that gray bar. It went from near the lowest all the way up to 4,500 tons in just 2 years. And that was essentially, Rob probably knows a lot more of the details, and so I'm going to ask him in a second. But to me, like, this was just an argument. That was not a scientific conclusion. That the assessment had nothing to do with that, setting that quota at that high level. In fact, that was set to.
I mean, just for the folks who are used to the US system, we don't have quite as much flexibility in what we're doing, given the Magnuson Act constrains the decision-making process quite significantly. That doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes, but the loudest voice doesn't quite win in this game.
Yeah.
Just another question on what I call are you referring to satisficing, as Peter Shelton would call it, under your structure decision making? So basically setting minimum performance standards to play the game. I know that's an Eastern Canada thing.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call it satisficing. Satisficing is something that it's like whether you're going to maximize, minimize, or satisfy. It's like it's a thing that you're doing. Whereas the decision context is more, it's something that is part of the structure of the strategy. Like it's a deliberate part of the process. So yeah, in there you could decide whether you're going to maximize, minimize, satisfy, whatever it is you're going to do. So that was a long answer to that question. So, going over so these are the objectives as they currently stand as of 2019 when we last revised these. And the only things that have been revised in the last couple of years are, I think we dithered a bit with this objective 3, but basically starting from the top, any management procedure that we test in a simulation has to meet objective 1. If it doesn't meet objective 1, it gets thrown out. And this is the basic, it has to stay above some limit reference point 95% of the time. At this point, we don't really even have management procedures that come near violating that. Initially, we did. This was initially an issue, for example, with the harvest control I just showed you, but no longer really is that much of an issue. But sablefish, as a lot of us are aware, have been fairly low over the past decade or so and are now coming back. But at the time, one of the main objectives of the industry, in that transition period, was to stop the decline in the stock. That was the primary objective that they were interested in. And so we looked at that. They gave us certain probabilities and things like that, and we just couldn't meet it. There was no way we were going to meet what they were talking about without closing the fishery. And then we also looked at the DFO policy, and the way that was written also would have closed the fishery or severely reduced the catches. So at the time we derived this second objective here that kind of implements the policy intent in a quantitative way, and of course allows the fishery to proceed, which the industry was happy with. But in this case, I'm going to show you a graph of this. Well, actually, it's right here. This one, basically, you in the operating model, when you're doing a test, you would look at the current state of the stock in that operating model, and then define this acceptable probability of decline over the next 10 years. So it's a short-term objective that's meant to promote rebuilding when the stock is in this below BMSY state. And so this has a little sliding scale here so that if the stock is down, you can see at the lower level here at 0.4 of BMSY, it's essentially very, this is in the US system close to where you would probably close the fishery in a 40-10 type of rule. This is about the 10. And there, the probability, acceptable probability of decline is about 5%. And then as the stock improves, that acceptable probability would increase as well to allow more chance of decline. So this was something that we took some time to think about the DFO policy and to implement it in a way that worked for everyone.
Excuse me, Sean, Maya has her hand up.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Sean, just a quick question on that previous slide. So could you speak briefly about what the definition of decline is necessarily? Because I could imagine there being management procedures that in 10 years have you just below BMSY. Would that still count as a declining scenario?
Well, so the decline is being measured on the operating model SSB, and so as you basically, I think, and we went over these statistics. I think, and I know Rob and I have been back and forth on this, whether we just do if the stock declined at all, like if the biomass 10 years from now is lower than the biomass today, that counts as a decline, right? In that replicate of the operating model. Now, in the DFO policy, that if you interpret that literally, that you could take it all kinds of ways. You could fit a trend, and in fact, I think that might even have been one of the ways we did it, was we fit a trend to the first 10 years in the projection of the SSB, and if that had a negative slope, that was counted. So Rob, why don't you chime in here, because I know you coded that. See if we can dust off some cobwebs from Rob's brain here.
I think you have it right, that we looked over a 10-year linear, just a linear decline over 10 years, and counted them up with the various replicates of the simulations.
Yeah.
So I think you've got it right.
So this depends. Like, you might have an operating model, you might have several operating models, and one of them puts the stock down at 0.4, another one puts it at 0.6, and those will have different acceptable probabilities. So they can, the one that starts at 0.6 can have more, can have up to whatever that is, 20% of the replicates can decline and still be acceptable. This particular objective has made quite a difference. We've rejected quite a few procedures because it doesn't meet this particular objective over the years. It's getting better now because we actually have some recruitment. But at the time, we had no recruitment and things were looking really bad. So this particular objective was quite influential. And you can see it's number 2 in the hierarchy. So if a procedure does not meet that one, it gets thrown out completely. And then we move on to 3, and 3 being sablefish, according to our operating models, are well below BMSY. So, and of course, as a long-lived species, it takes a long time to rebuild. Dealing with this for a while, and this is another challenge dealing with the DFO policy, because the policy wants the stock to be at BMSY. And of course, you can't just get there overnight, right? Like you can with salmon or something. So this is, you can see that what we've done here is, we've created a little bit of a couple of conditions there, that the condition B there is a special condition depending on when you're rebuilding from the cautious zone. So this is kind of where we were at the time. And then trying to get the stock to be at BMSY at a certain 2 generations out into the future. And then just recently, this past year, we actually fixed this date to 2052. Rather than have because if it's always 2 generations out, then there can always be wiggle room in the procedure. The procedures can always be a little more risky than they should, because you keep pushing the window for BMSY out into the future. And so we saw that was actually happening as we were kind of picking MPs that were a bit too, not really going after this objective. So that date has now been fixed. So that will actually also that become another influential objective over time. Basically, if an MP meets these 3 objectives, at that point, it's all up to the fishery. They can decide what they want. And so one of their objectives here is a minimum. They want the TAC to be above 1,992 tons, which is the lowest one they've had so far. And that was actually one of the MPs made that. And then simply to maximize catch over 10 years. So these are the objectives that are being used to select management procedures in this process.
Hey, Sean.
Yep.
Just a quick check-in. Your kind of time is up, but we were a little bit ahead of schedule. So I haven't seen your presentation, but maybe another 5 more minutes. I think that's probably the meat of it. Okay.
And so just
Thanks.
getting into a few key things that we've learned along the way, the main one being that the Pareto principle is real. We think that essentially we basically learned about 80% of what we needed to from the MSE in about the first 20% of the MSE work that we did. And so just to point that out, so here's on the right, back in a paper that we actually did in one of Andre's special issues of Fisheries Research in 2007-8, we were finding that the optimal harvest rate, target harvest rate for BC sablefish was somewhere in the range of 6% a year, which before that, the thinking was 9 to 10% a year. And so we initially came up with that about 6%. And so over the years, this really hasn't changed very much. It's varied between 5.5% and 7% over the years and operating models. And this is our most recent one here from 2019, where we were looking at economics and we account for discarding at sea and all kinds of different things that we're including in the procedures. And you can see this range again is 5% to 7% in the kind of best possible case. One of the main reasons is at sea discarding, that we lose a lot of production annually to at sea discarding. This is the management procedure. What industry initially wanted as a transparent decision rule. This is essentially all the information we use to set the TAC each year. So here we have the landings and the abundance indices, and then the model fitted to those. And then that outputs estimates of BMSY and FMSY. Well, actually not FMSY. We input the F because we don't allow it to estimate FMSY. It will be really badly biased. So you can see the current target harvest rate is about 6%. There's a meta rule that goes along with that, and this was intended to ease the transition from a maximum target harvest rate of 9.5% down to 5.5%, which is what is needed to meet those long-term objectives. And there are some other smaller kind of meta rules that go along with setting annual TACs. This is just an example of the what's happened over the past 10 years, and basically looking at the issue with this fishery. There's a lot of carryover going on, so it's hard to show. Here's the TAC coming from the MP and here's the catch, because they are very closely related. But there are carryovers and people managing their quota from year to year. So this graph just has the TAC plus carryover against the catch. But if you look at the TAC from the MP versus the catch, adjusted for carryover, the line would go right through these points here. So just a wrap up of why MPs have been used consistently. There is a strong mandate, or there was, for change back in 2005 from the best assessment approach. The things that went on over those 5 years during the transition period, the data were just continuing to decline despite catches being reduced. So by 2010, TACs were already low, fairly low. And it was fairly straightforward to transition to MPs that were putting out similar TACs. So it wasn't like, going from a 4,200 ton catch down to a 2,000 ton catch because you implemented an MP. But essentially that's what happened over those 5 years. The decision context in this case was established fairly early, and everybody was on board. The industry was invested the whole time, and there was a lot of experience and stuff with a lot of the modeling stuff. So I'm going to skip this one.
Excuse me, Sean, Andre has his hand up.
Oh, yeah.
You may just defer this, but I think most people have never heard of the term meta rule. I think I know what it is, but I'm suspect most people don't. So if people care what a meta rule is, you might explain it, because we used to harvest control rules, not harvest control rules with meta rules.
Yeah. I think meta rule is just something that somebody came up with recently. I don't know if I came up with it or someone else in our group came up with it. Just something that you can't express simply by looking at this harvest control rule here. So this picture is what's used to set the TAC, but there's actually something behind that, which is this stuff. And probably not a good term. This slide is just describing how we deal with some of the key uncertainties we're dealing with right now. For example, at-sea discarding. We've looked at a whole range of ways to implement changes in management procedures, anywhere from full retention of all sablefish to different accountability schemes for at-sea discarding. There's been some uncertainty about the size of recent recruitment, which is not really a big deal for us because as I showed you, the maximum Fs tend to be fairly conservative anyway, so it doesn't really affect that much. And I'll skip that one. So this is the last slide, and I just wanted to tie this into the coastwide sablefish operating model and movement. So as I mentioned at the beginning, like we've known that sablefish move. That's Beamish and lots of other people have looked at this since the 1970s and 80s. So we were kind of aware of that. But we also recognized that site fidelity was fairly high, on the order of 80% or so of fish don't really leave BC that much. A lot of the movement would be buried within natural mortality rate estimates, and any influx of young fish would come in as recruitment process errors, given that we don't really track them until they're age 3. So there's kind of anything can happen before age 3, and then they need to kind of they're in the model as of that, and they have to kind of march along with everybody else. But there's really not a whole lot of evidence for lack of fit in the age composition data that we have, except in a couple of data sets. So the focus in BC has been, okay, and again, getting back to the kind of 80-20 rule is manage the stock in BC as though it is as though it's a closed population, because less can go wrong with that probably compared to assuming we're going to get rescue effects from outside in particular. But of course, we can't test this, and that's our whole interest in the coastwide operating models, to actually test that and see what direction things could go and how we may adapt things for that. Okay, so the slides are fairly straightforward when you put them together, but then when you start talking about them, then there's a bit of embellishment along the way. So I'll take any questions you might have.
Great. We're going to move in. Thank you for that, Sean. And we're going to move into a full group discussion. First of all, do you have any do you have any clarification questions for Sean? Or any basic MSC questions for Melissa? We're going to go into a discussion kind of, between the two. So. John, do you see any hands up anywhere? No clarifying questions?
There are no hands.
No. Dan.
Dan has a hand up. Yep.
Like a real hand.
Yeah, Dan's hand is up.
Buddy. You're on mute, Dan.
Sorry, I videoed, but yeah, my question is, of those objectives, there was nothing in there about really, there's things that relate to stability, but there was nothing explicit about stability of TACs over time. And I wondered if that did not is that not something that the industry was put forward?
Yeah, that was something that was in the procedure in a couple of different ways. Our original procedures, one of these so-called meta rules or was to only allow a TAC change or limit the TAC change to less than 15%. Right, so they wanted that rather than have the variability happen as part of the rule, kind of accept the variability. They want to control the variability to 15%. Again, that was one of the ones that just never made it. Those kinds of procedures got eliminated early because limiting that variability, what ends up happening is you take the risk from the fishery and you transfer it to the stock, right? When you're dampening catch, especially if it's fairly high, you're basically transferring risk onto the stock, and that's what was happening. So now the most we can get away with is this 1A, 1B here, which one of the issues they have is that any suspicion of an increase in the Canadian sablefish TAC affects the Japanese price. And so even a 100-ton increase often would trigger a price change or a price response. So we put in this rule several years ago that only increase the TAC if it's greater than 200 tons different from the previous one, but always accept a decrease. So that handles a bit of the variability. And in the end, there's not a lot of variability coming out anyway. Like we have had some 15, 17% TAC changes in the past.
Don, it's Rob here. I think also the surplus production model and the procedure is fairly resistant to chasing data points. So there's a certain amount of stiffness to it. It's highly tuned to get the performance that we were looking for. So it tends to reduce the volatility a bit, as well as the meta rules.
Lisa, you're muted if you're talking.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Because I can initiate some discussion, but I want everyone to be clear or have other questions answered here first.
Mike Okaneski has a question.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, thank you. I may have missed this, but I heard about movement, and I thought that meant movement out, but the influx of fish coming in from either north or south, is that, I mean, is there some kind of equilibrium that seems fairly constant on that, or do you have an answer to that question, I guess?
Well, it's certainly not something that we are able to estimate year to year. Luke Rogers, in particular, has been looking at kind of equilibrium transition in and out. I don't know if he's presenting here this week, but kind of showing similar things that the older data was showing, that fish tagged in BC, about 85% of them tend to stay within the region they were tagged in. So, I mean, we certainly don't have estimates from year to year, and it, especially lately, where we had that fairly large recruitment signal back in whatever it was, 2015 or 16, of that cohort, and guys on the grounds were waiting for it to appear, and it seemed like it never appeared, or was taking a long time to appear, and so there was concern that they had moved. did they move south or whatever it was? And so yeah, we don't have estimates from year to year.
All right. Do you see any other hands up, John?
I do not.
Okay. So if there's no more questions specific, yeah, thank you for that, Sean. So we can continue into any other questions or discussion around that. Oh, let me look at here. Yeah, so for those folks, we can talk about like why are you here? Why'd you show up here today? Or do you have anything to talk about phase one concerns or perspective around, or your hopes and dreams about phase one? John, you can drop those questions in the chat box to initiate some discussion here. But I want to hear from some of you that and still we can talk about those two presentations as well. But I want to hear from you why you're here and what's your perspective, what's your hopes and dreams about where we are with this MSE in phase one. Crickets? Okay. Well, actually, I'm just going to take a moment of silence, see if anybody comes up. There's 61% of you that walked in curious.
I think Jane has something to say.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I have a question for Sean. So I'm really interested in the differences between the Alaskan sablefish fishery and the BC fishery. Obviously, you all have a lot more pot gear usage. You've had the size limit in place for a long time. And now Alaska wants to release fish, and they want to fish a lot more pot gear than previously. And I'm just curious how these types of shifts in, whether it be gear usage or the adoption of size limits or other types of voluntary releasing, how that plays into the MSE process in terms of defining objectives.
Yeah. So our pot fishery, which we call them traps, they're outfitted with escape rings. So that particular fishery has the most ability to control its size distribution of its catch. And of course, the price is very sensitive, as you know, to size. So they can do some kind of invisible high grading or by escape rings, and also how much bait they put in the trap as well, and soak times and things like that. The hook and line fishery, they don't have a major issue. They probably release about the same tonnage, about 100 tons a year, 120 tons a year of fish under 55 centimeters. But that's a much bigger fishery. Like that's the, halibut, sablefish are going through those fish. A lot more boats involved and stuff. And then there's the bottom trawl fishery, which that fishery is very sensitive to recruitment. So in years like in the past few years, when we've had lots of recruitment around, that fishery is discarding 500 to 800 tons a year at considerably higher mortality rates than what you would have in trap, and to lesser degree hook and line. The thing we have that's a benefit to all of us is that we have a monitoring program we get pretty good quantitative estimates of this discarding. which means we can actually fit to that stuff in the operating models. So we actually have a pretty good accounting for it. And then of course, its impact on procedures going forward. So one of the things we did in the past round was we were looking at ways of holding the trawl fishery accountable, because one of the big questions was, should we remove the size limit and force full retention of all sablefish of all sizes? And if you did that, of course, you can jack up the target harvest rate now, because you're not really throwing away yield, and so the yield goes up, but the price dynamics affect it because you get a lot of small fish, and so there's a lot of stuff like that we were trying to model this year. But the monitoring program is helpful because we can get good estimates of that stuff, and the monitoring program, it doesn't work the same for all types of gear. So a big switch in gear, I don't know what kind of monitoring you have, but this is, it's electronic monitoring for hook and line trap and observers for trawl, although they're starting to implement some electronic monitoring as well. So there are going to be monitoring issues if you are going to have a size limit where you can essentially discard fish without penalty. And then if there is going to be a penalty, then you definitely need a good monitoring. It's going to have implications for monitoring.
So would you say then that, thinking about data quality from the monitoring perspective, and also, the potential wastage of mortality from releases, are those the types of things that might feed into desired outcomes or objectives for okay.
Yeah. I mean, so that big table I showed at the end there with all the harvest rates on it, like I said, we were looking at all kinds of different ways. And this was a request of the trawl industry, because they don't want full retention, because that would have huge consequences for the fisheries that they're actually pursuing while they're catching these fish. So they wanted us to look at ways of providing an incentive. And so, we came up with a way to kind of amortize, like if a vessel runs into a lot of small fish and has to discard them, then rather than have them pay that price on the spot, we had different approaches to amortizing that over time and counting it against their legal quota, their legal size fish. So they could basically pay for their undersized discarding in legal quota. And it turns out that system actually was a couple of the top procedures for doing things like, rebuilding the stock back to BMSY. Those schemes were much better at doing that than continuing on with, discarding without penalty. A full retention did the best, but these other ones were a pretty good compromise on them. So that's kind of where we're at right now. Is once people saw some of the economic issues with full retention, that's probably not going to go forward. But yeah, that's your production, right? So, if it's a good chunk of your production, then your management procedure performance is going to be very sensitive to it. That's been the biggest, probably the biggest factor. Once we got the procedures kind of dialed into what the production actually is, rather than the 4,200 ton quotas, we got it down in the 2,400 ton to that range. Now all the sensitivity is to the juvenile, to the sublegal discarding.
Thanks for the question, Jane. Anybody else? we're about ready for a break.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any hands, Misha.
Yeah, there's a little chat going on. Lynn is Lynn's interested. She's here. She's showing up because she's been listening to well, you can read it, but she wants to learn more about MSE in general and see how sablefish compares to Pacific halibut and Pacific whiting. So thanks, Lynn, for that. I think that's all I see. Okay. All right. Well, it's about time for a break anyway. We're going to have about a 15-minute break. I'll give you 2 extra minutes, and we'll meet back here at 3:50. Okay? And Chris, if you'll put that up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
Are there people staying logged in and just turning off their video? Is that what's happening?
That would be the recommended thing to do.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, Jane. Yeah. And you are free to choose whatever you'd like to do.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, everyone. It's time.
Okay, we're here.
You hear? It's 3:50.
Most importantly, Maya's here.
I know. That's great.
And most of my lab are here with pom-poms to keep it going.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
John, don't change your day job. I'm afraid. You know, stick with what you do. Cheerleading is not for you, my friend.
All right. Well, I'm going to get started, and Chris, you can take that down. Thank you. All right. I love seeing faces. I'm going to touch you. Just kidding. Okay. So welcome back, everybody, from our break. Our next topic is going to be around the OM, operating model. But first, I'm just dying to know, Chris, pop it up. What did you have for breakfast this morning? Only 7. I did quick math over the break, and only about 70% of you answered the first 2 questions. So this one is really important. Andre, I suspect your candy bar. That's you. There you went. I put it in there just for you. And observers, you know, you're into the polling too. All right. Who had the biggest, fattest breakfast ever, and what was it?
You know it's me, Misha. Sausage,
What
eggs.
was it? Sausage and eggs.
And,
oh my gosh. And
waffles.
And
Coffee. With sugar.
any fruit?
Yeah, right.
Okay, right. Actually, it's dinner time for me. So break, I went downstairs, and actually they were eating breakfast downstairs. So I just ate a piece of sausage really quick myself.
Cool.
Anyway, okay, so I like it. Coffee, just coffee. You people. I don't remember. Whoever said I don't remember either. Anyway, thank you for that. Thank you for playing with us. And who was it? Samuel Johnson. I saw you moving around a bit. Thank you during the last one. And when I asked you to before the session started, I saw you. Okay. So anyway, welcome back from the break. Our next topic is on the Northeast Pacific Sablefish model. Our objective here is for you to understand the focus, why the focus is on the Pacific, Northeast Pacific, and the structure of the OM. And our lovely, lovely Maya Kapoor is the technical lead on the MSE, and her PhD work at the University of Washington involves building the operating and estimation models and building simulations. Her work is the foundation on which we can build upon in the future. Like with any structure, you want it to be strong to survive, and she's going to share with us now the bones of this foundation. So go ahead, note takers, John, Melissa, chat box watcher, Miss Carrie, just giving a little reminder. And also during the presentation, if you have a clarifying question in the moment, go ahead and raise your hand. And if it's something more detailed, if you want to jot it down on a piece of paper and bring it up in the discussion, that'd be great. So thank you. Go ahead, Maya.
Thanks, Misha. Just want to make sure you guys can see my screen and hear me okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. So thanks for the introduction. Again, I'm Maya Kapoor. I'm in Andre Punt's lab. So I recognize a lot of the folks on the call. So some of you may have seen an earlier version of this talk as we sort of did our parade of presentations last fall. And so I always like to start with the kind of 30,000 foot view of this project. And so what we're really trying to do here is give a little background on the work we have been doing to date for the closed loop simulation framework for the MSE, mainly focused on the operating model for this talk. And so as I go along, I'm interested in getting your all's feedback on sort of the initial decisions we've made, how we built this model, and really the chief uncertainties that are going to be represented in it, and if those are accurately capturing the uncertainties that are appropriate to your region or your interest. So something I really want to emphasize is that this is really a research exercise at this time. Melissa did a pretty good job of kind of highlighting this, but I myself as a scientist and the whole PSAT are very sensitive to the extant management strategy work that's being done, particularly in British Columbia and also in Alaska. So please know that once I hand in my PhD in this phase 1, there's not suddenly going to be this huge, range-wide MSE that will supersede what is going on in your individual region. So instead, I encourage you to look at this as a vehicle for evaluating regional management strategies in the context of broader uncertainty. So I really have used this metaphor several talks now, but I like to illustrate how the operating model is the foundational component to these future questions we want to ask about sablefish. So you can think of reality as this photograph. So this is Swan Lake, which I believe is up in British Columbia. And this photograph is very detailed. There's thousands of pixels in it. And there's a lot of, things that we can note about what's happening in that reality. Our operating model is necessarily going to be an abstraction of that reality. So our goal is really to capture the chief contours or dynamics of that real photo in a way that's parsimonious and can be run on my computer within a reasonable amount of time. And necessarily when we go in and build our estimation models, and again, this is a topic that we'll discuss in more detail tomorrow, the estimation models or assessment models might be even more granular or less detailed than that operating model. So I kind of like to think about this continuum of complexity, and today's talk is really focused more on this middle pane. And so the basic structure of the operating model is spatial. It also has 2 sexes and it's age structured. And what we've been doing over the last year or so now is conditioning the model to the large amount of input data we have from our various regions. In a little bit, I'll show a slide that overviews the data inputs we're working with, but anyone who has worked in the MSE framework can sympathize that it's never straightforward when you're working with totally different data types across many different regions. So hopefully folks are understanding that this spatial structure is really kind of the chief axis of uncertainty we have for the sablefish stock. And so in the next set of slides, what I'm going to show is a series of maps kind of breaking down how the operating model is spatially structured. So on the inset, I just put another one of these abstract paintings just to remind us that any line that we are drawing through space is necessarily a simplification of the reality that's going on. And so, of course, there's an infinite number of ways we could break down this map, but we have to consider that parsimony question. So in this first figure, I'm just showing the EEZs, the colored polygons. And here what I've done is I've added these gray dashed lines, and these represent the boundaries of a growth analysis we conducted as part of my first dissertation chapter. And briefly, this analysis worked with fishery independent data from all 3 regions. And we used a modeling approach that basically had the model tell us where we thought the best breakpoints were spatially, meaning where did we think we could define zones between which sablefish growth was the most distinct. And that paper was published in Fisheries Research, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that if you have it. So when we take those lines, we end up with 4 regions, which in this talk and in future talks, I call stocks. So the stock is really the demographic engine of the model. So this is the strata at which sablefish are sharing growth rates, and importantly, the stock recruit relationship operates at these stock levels. So there's 4 of them illustrated here. And so the final thing that needs to happen to make the whole operating model play nicely in the code is we need to overlay this image of these 4 biological stocks on top of our 3 management regions. And when you do that, you end up with these 6 sub areas. And so this colored map kind of shows how you have various stocks which straddle, given management areas. So for example, here in this blue area, you have sub area B3 and sub area A3. They of course adhere to different or belong within different management regions, but they share biological information. And so this setup enables us to compute everything at a stratification which is perfectly nested within demography and management. So the next slide is all about the data inputs. So this is just showing on the x-axis the name of the fleet, and they're paneled by the respective management regions. And on the y-axis, I'm listing the type of data we have. The point here is just that we have something of everything from each region. As you can see, there's quite a few that are going in there. One thing I wanted to point out is you'll see this label VAST in the x-axis, and those are the results of a survey standardization exercise we undertook. So instead of just using the existing surveys that were done in each region, we undertook this VAST exercise where we did a spatial temporal standardization and got estimates for the index of abundance from those 2 regions. Those 2 regions being Alaska and the California current. In BC, we're using the surveys that are used in their MSE exercise. And so next, I'm just going to walk through a couple data inputs that are novel to this project. And I will start with work that was done by Luke Rogers, who was a postdoc on this project. And he was responsible for looking at movement. So he worked with a huge data set of tag recapture for sablefish, and that spans the entirety of the Northeast Pacific and about 40 years of data. So he built a model which estimated movement probabilities between these 6 sub areas that we are interested in modeling. And one of the interesting things that he found is that as a proportion, so not biomass or numbers, but as a proportion, it appears that British Columbia is acting as the net source of sablefish moving elsewhere. And so for those of you not familiar with this type of plot, basically I have the sub areas on the X and Y axis, and where you see the colored number, that tells you what proportion of sablefish we estimate are moving from a given area on the X to a given area on the Y. So big thanks to Luke for doing the analysis to come up with these values. These are going to feed into how all these sub areas link together in our model. Another input I mentioned earlier was a reanalysis of growth data. So I indicated that for my first dissertation chapter, we looked at kind of finding a method to tell us areas between which growth was the most distinct. And once we found those areas, we went back in and estimated the parameters of the von Bertalanffy growth curve. So earlier when there was some discussion in the chat, someone had asked, how old is a BC sablefish of about 55 centimeters? And I had sort of eyeballed looking off this pink curve to be quite young. And Sam Johnson actually looked up, and it appears to be about 4 years old. So there definitely is a pretty strong climb of sablefish growth as you go south to north. So this is also useful information to go into our operating model. The last demographic input I want to mention was some work done by Ben Williams. He was at ADF&G before. He's now with Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and he was able to use macroscopic histology data to estimate maturity at age, again, at our four demographic sub areas, which is quite useful. So I just want to pause here and point out kind of how much background work has already gone into this effort. And that's a big thanks to our regional leads, Melissa, Brendan, and Carrie, for kind of herding this group together, getting people excited about it. And I feel that already we've accomplished a lot more than I certainly could have alone as a PhD student. So thanks to all these folks which are involved. So the last little section here is just about uncertainties in the operating model. So this is an area where we really would like your guys' feedback. So what I'm going to do here is highlight the main uncertainties that we plan to investigate during this phase 1 of operating model development, and then we can talk a bit about phase 2. So in phase 1, the principal uncertainty, like I've mentioned, is spatial structure. So we're constructing this operating model with the intention of fitting the data it produces to a suite of estimation models. And I've shown kind of an example of what these can look like in this right-hand column. And they may have distinct spatial structure from the operating model. So that's really getting at the misspecification question that Melissa described at the beginning. Another important consideration is it's more model focused, but it's all about the specification of selectivity. And following Sean's talk, I wish I had also put retention on here, because I understand that that's a serious consideration in especially BC. And as we're working on the assessment for sablefish in the California current this year, it's also important in our region as well. So what I'm showing in this figure are the selectivity curves as used in the current regional assessments, but I'm planning to do some simplifications in the existing operating model. And that mostly applies for the West Coast. And that's largely because building these more fancy, complicated selectivity structures and estimating the parameters of them might be more than the model can handle. And then the final uncertainty that we've thought about quite a bit is the potential for confounding or confusion of the operating model between recruitment, the sharing of recruitment within sub areas, and the movement of age 0 fish. So a lot of my tuning efforts are focused on this, but this is a big question that I anticipate will perhaps bleed into phase 2. And so this slide just kind of is more of a food for thought for things that we might consider for that phase 2. The first, which is on this left-hand side, are all about states of nature. So how environmental features might influence the dynamics of the stock via things like recruitment, changes in mortality. Another thing that we're not able to consider right now are topics like multi-species interactions or perhaps very distinct movement paradigms. Another thing that would be applicable to phase 2, and I think Andre brought this up in his question, is about this thing we call implementation error. So this is something like modeling how fisher behavior might change in response to a given tack. So we could perhaps investigate scenarios where fisheries don't attain the entirety of their tack, either for economic or other reasons. And I'm aware that there is some discussion of this happening in Alaska, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's of interest to other groups too. But I just want to highlight that, we are open within reason to hearing what components are of interest to you. And our goal is that this first iteration of the operating model is contained enough to be done within the next 2 years, but captures that, like Sean said, that important 80% of the uncertainty that we're interested in for this stock. So with that, I will take any questions.
Maya, there's a question from Alexander Stubbs.
Sure, it's in the chat.
No, I have a question here, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the primary issues in the U.S. sablefish fishery is the establishment of the statewide overfishing limit, while discards due to trawl bycatch are centered largely in one region in the Bering Sea. Your subareas don't correspond with different areas that quotas are separated into for the directed fishery, and it doesn't seem to be able to answer the question of if gross overages in one area like the Bering Sea have an impact on other regulatory areas. So I guess my question is, do you have the data resolution to break this operating model into management areas further, like Western Gulf, Aleutian Islands, Bering Sea, Central Gulf, West Yakutat, and Southeast?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is basically, let me scroll up really quick, is basically about, how fixed are these sub areas? And in general, for this phase one, they are largely fixed. And the reason for that is when you split up the map into a different, stratification, it's not just a matter of, is the data available there? It's also a question of parameterizing, things like growth and particularly movement. So it would be perhaps straightforward for me to just assign the same growth parameters if we were to split up this big area A4, which I think is what you're referring to. But re-estimating movement between those would be quite challenging. But just to make sure I understood what you had said, because I want to capture or understand what you're interested in. You're saying that there isn't attainment happening to the tax depending on the sub area at a finer rate?
I guess. I mean, one of the big issues in the U.S. sablefish fishery is that trawl discards are centered on one small regulatory area in particular. And I think as someone that's involved in the directed fishery and also as a biologist, I mean, the SSC made the recommendation that there be a statewide overfishing limit for the Alaska-wide stock, right? And so I think a thing that science needs to be able to inform policy is whether that statewide OFL is actually appropriate or not. So my concern is that by breaking a large percentage of the Gulf of Alaska, Aleutian Islands, and BSII into one region when they have very different demographic structures of fish, and I would argue growth curves and migration patterns, that we might not be able to inform policy in a way that would be most beneficial to managing the fishery.
Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. If anyone else from my team wants to comment, that's totally fine too. I don't need to blabber.
I'll speak up here. I mean, sure. This is certainly a case where we appreciate you raising the issue and we want to be aware of it. It's also a case where we're trying to balance regional interests with the big picture Northeast Pacific work, and what Maya can accomplish in a first iteration. So while we're lumping that A4 region into one large area based on the demographics of growth, and actually that boundaries, so it's based on data, right? It's not to say that something more specific couldn't be done in the future. So this would fall for me into this phase 2 category. Like, let's get the tool built, get it running, test it well first, and show that we can have success before we think about how we might dive deeper into, these specific issues. But the general issue of discard is something that I think will come up in all regions. And it's definitely something that I think within the existing structure we can tackle. And so others, please speak up on this front as well.
Thanks, Melissa. This is Carrie here. I think, I agree with your answer. It's definitely an issue that is relevant to Alaska and something we've talked about in our small groups, but trying to keep the scope of this phase 1 to a manageable load was the ultimate goal here. And while I have the floor, the next hand that I see up is from Andre Punt.
I was just going to say that, we need, as we go through these discussions, to keep track of suggestions that can't be implemented in phase one. But not only do we need to do that, we need to also think about, as Maya pointed out, the data needs to be able to support the structure that we're talking about. So we can create lots of models, but if we have no data, you'll get the answer you guessed. So for some of the reasons you're splitting this up is data as well as everything else. So I think this is something we need to flag. If we go forward with this, we also need to think about the data to support these models. So let's keep both of those in parallel, the data and the model structure. And I think Ellie's got a comment in the chat on this.
And we have a hand raised from John Budrick.
Yes, can you hear me? Good. Just a quick question on the constraints that this structure will pose on evaluation of management procedures, et cetera. I see some lines here relative to the Washington and Canada border, I believe, where there's a segment that's still of the same color. Am I wrong there?
So are you looking at B2 and
Yeah, the higher of the two, that one being that it's in a Canadian jurisdiction, but it's to the south of that's U.S. management.
You're right. Yeah, I got too creative with my color choices. They are in distinct sub areas.
Oh, okay, good. Thanks for the clarification, because I was like, okay, that might be somewhat constraining. Being that I'm a Californian, it's an odd question, right? But then again, my follow-up question would kind of help inform things. There may be some additional interest in structure within California. You've identified the 36 line and the biological implications of growth for the assessment underlying the operating model, but maturity for sure. That was a pretty distinct difference. So somewhat surprising. But my question is more with regard to the spatial areas and the ability to, subsequent to the operating model in a management procedure, to basically be able to implement finer spatial resolution, given that we have the West Coast bottom trawl survey that we use to apportion biomass within a given region within our assessments. I don't know that can be used in the context of this to evaluate higher spatial resolution.
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, basically doing anything at a stratification finer than this, and that means allocating, catches, all that sort of thing, isn't really possible with this framework. And something I should also make clear is and we'll talk about this a little more tomorrow too, but the whole procedure of going from F to catches back into these areas is done by fleets. So, so I guess the short answer is no, that would be more of a phase 2 thing. Is that kind of what you're getting at, like more detail within that C1 area?
Kind of. I think on this, you've covered some of the political considerations, but there's also just management considerations as well that have spatial implications. And one of those being that in California, a very major break for us is at 40 degrees, 10 minutes north latitude, and that being a break point for our shelf rockfish allocations, et cetera. And that being the case, there's some concern about the fact that we have within California with the same fishery, people are targeting stocks with delineations at different latitudes, such as sablefish, of course, 36. You've got short spine thorny heads and long spine thorny heads at 34, 34.27, which is Point Conception. And then you've got your shelf rockfish, which are in aggregate of great value to California at 4010, both of which are somewhat constrained by potential sablefish interactions and encounters. So being that we're basically in our management apportioning in our catch shares program according to different latitudes for different species, essentially we're having different baskets of apples and oranges of various sizes depending on the areas that they're being stratified before they're being allocated. And so some consistency there for a management perspective would probably be helpful so that we have something that's reflective of the proportions that are coming out of each of the various areas in terms of their relative abundance, rather than the allocations being based on various management lines and what you get's what you get. But it's not consistent in terms of the areas that are being represented in those allocations. So 4010 being a major location for us in terms of interest in California, that's why that comes up relative to the 36 line. I understand there are biological considerations, but that being the case, it doesn't necessarily dictate that it would be a management line per se. As I understand, that southern boundary was just the southern boundary of the trawl survey at one point, and that's why that was there. But now there's another supporting potential reason because of in the vicinity being some biological differences. But that affects assessment, but not necessarily where you put your management line. So that's why I bring up this other management consideration relative to 4010 and the ability to analyze that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing all that up. I trust that's been captured in the notes.
It is. And, I appreciate people's concerns with the desire for finer spatial resolution compared to what we've outlined here, which is a function of, essentially the scale at which we currently run our stock assessments based on our regional political boundaries, right? Not management boundaries. And the biology of the stock, which is kind of to me, the first low-lying issue. As we think about how we might move forward with finer spatial resolution in the longer term, I think going back to Andre's point with regards to we need data to parameterize those and we'll need to think pretty hard about, are we going to slice and dice the data in so many different ways that we produce more noise and less signal, right? And that can we actually estimate parameters within our modeling frameworks to inform those finer spatial resolutions? And I think that's a longer term discussion. And I'm happy that people are bringing that up now, and we want to know about this so that we can plan accordingly as we go forward.
And sorry, I raised my hand again. I don't know if there's anybody else who's in the queue ahead of me to respond to the continued line of questioning. Just to say, I understand that to be the case. My consideration just being, would it be possible, to not necessarily split things out per se into a finer pie per se, but to use the West Coast bottom trawl swept area percentages to break an area, right? And then you can use that information and the demographics that you have for the underlying entire region to go forth and move the model forward with a finer spatial structure, given that we have the information to break up the biomass at any time step using the trawl survey data. I don't know. It's just a thought. I mean, that would, of course, there's the loose end, of course, of the movement and being able to track that between regions as if it's important. But that part can be largely ignored if you already have it for the area in question. If you're subdividing that area, given what you have from the West Coast bottom trawl survey, I think that might, at least in our region, provide the necessary means to break things up into a finer spatial resolution, whether it's now or in phase 2.
Thanks for that, John.
The next hand that I see up is Michelle Robinson.
Hi, thanks. So just a question following up on Melissa, your statement. And this question also popped in my head as Maya was giving the presentation, and when she talked about the implementation of the TAC and the implementation error potential. And my question is just more on the science side of things, and whether there is agreement amongst the three management areas on the science side relative to the parameters to use in the estimation models as well as the operating models.
Yeah, I can try that question. So it's an iterative process, and in terms of when you say the science side from each region, I'm thinking of our team that's working on this now. The operating model parameters are largely going to be conditioned to the data. So once we get to a point that we're confident with how well that operating model is fitting the extant data from each region, those are probably going to be the sets of parameters that we're comfortable moving forward with. And it's not necessarily a one and done thing. The estimation model is, those are still a little more on the horizon of what we're building. And of course, the parameters there will depend chiefly on the type of estimation model we work with. Did that answer your question? Did I miss part of it?
Not exactly. So I'm just thinking of the stock assessments in the three areas, and whether there's agreement amongst the scientists and the PSTAT or the stock assessment teams in each of those areas to actually use the same values relative to natural mortality and growth and length of age. And
okay, sounds like you're more asking how faithful is the or how similar is the operating model to the extant assessment models in each.
No, just whether or not there's agreement amongst the scientists. So you had talked about the implementation of the TAC, and I'm looking at the actual setting of the TAC in each of those areas.
Okay. I'm sorry. That's actually something we're going to dedicate a whole session to tomorrow. So we're going to talk all about management procedures and basically how different harvest control rules largely that we can test against the operating model. And one of those suites of management procedures will necessarily be the status quo for each region.
And I guess I can chime in here too, Michelle, in that your question with respect to how the operating model will be parameterized. For example, I imagine you're thinking of things like what value of M will we use, right? We have different assumptions across regions. We have not necessarily agreed what the value will be. We will do that. I think to some degree, as Maya tunes this model to the existing data, we'll probably learn something about what values of M allow us to fit the existing data across all regions. And that tuning process will inform some of those settings essentially in the operating model. I think the same will go for stock and recruitment assumptions and that kind of thing. And as Maya alluded to, the estimation models are yet to be determined, but the low bar is using essentially what we do currently. And the rest is open for discussion to some degree. And Andre also writes in the chat, ultimately there will be sensitivity tests to some of these fixed parameters. Yes, absolutely.
Sam?
Hi, I did. Thank you. Hi, Maya. Good to see you again. Thank you for the call.
Hey,
Sam. Can you go back to your key uncertainty slide?
Sure. Give me a moment. This guy or phase one?
Yeah, phase one uncertainties. Is there any of this that you would be like, I don't know, I'm thinking of this as someone who has experience trying to put MSE stuff into a PhD thesis. Is there any of this stuff that you're willing to just drop? Because the best advice I ever got was one trick per paper, right? Like kind of focus it, and then kind of get through.
Well, you clearly weren't. Andre's style is there were way more results than we could possibly print here.
Yeah.
I am actually listening on this call, Maya, as you abuse me.
Sorry. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. You're really speaking to this parsimony question, because I sort of glossed it over with words, but buried in this recruitment image are easily 3 or 4 different sort of levers we could pull at tweaking how recruitment is represented in this model. And so I think in terms of dropping one, I wouldn't drop that one, but I would more choose with, the consultation of my group, which lever we're going to pull.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, or push it off to, future work or a different, different student, so that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I just, while I had the floor, I want to say, like, that's the same kind of reasoning you would apply to these, like, deeper spatial resolution questions, right? Like, this is for getting a handle on risk right now of the spatial mismatch question. And there's, like, drilling into finer details probably get you outside of that 80% you're going to cover in the first 20% of the work. I think you're doing a great job here.
Thanks, Sam.
We have a hand raised from Andre next.
Yeah, just to echo the last point, I mean, one of the things that we're raising here is are the factors we'd like to examine, and it's really good to get them all on the table, but as sort of Sam indicated, there's going to be a triage stage to identify what are the things are most likely to have an impact, and then to focus on those. One of the challenges of MSEs is you're running thousands of analyses, and so what the group is really going to have to think about is presentation, and how to actually identify what is making changes in the results. So some really careful triaging is important. I will like to focus on the fact that a lot of the attention is on the spatial, and there are 2 reasons for that. One is this is something that's never really been looked at for sablefish before. So when we're thinking about triaging, looking at what other MSEs have already examined and found not to be that important, can be put down lower on the priority list. Yes, and I do want Maya to graduate before she retires, as opposed to after.
That would be preferable.
Carrie, Sam, did you want to go again?
Yeah, actually speaking, yes, I do. Thanks, Misha. I was just going to say, have you looked into the Atlantic bluefin tuna MSE stuff, like any of the SCRS papers out of that?
Not in depth, I'm aware of them.
Yeah, they're kind of honing in on the spatial mismatch of control topic. So if you're interested in that, you can email me and I can point you towards papers and stuff.
Okay, thanks.
No worries.
So I don't think there's any more hands raised, but I do want to we just got, another 10, 15 minutes here. And I just want to, I don't know if you saw in the chat box, but like some of if anybody else wants to comment on the aspects of the OM that you think are most important, some things have been brought up where we are catching them in the parking lot notes to things to like not yet looking at. And then also what are key hypotheses like axis of uncertainty are most important to capture in the model. So those are 2, just for anybody else that, wants to speak up or give any feedback on that. We're looking at those in particular to add to what we've already discussed.
Andre has his hand up.
No, it's Jane. Or looks like Jane.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having mouse misfunction. So I would agree with the selectivity and the recruitment. Those seem really important. And just thinking about Alaska, there was some conversation in the chat about, our coastwide OFL versus the smaller OFLs and the high exploitation rate in the eastern GOA, but then the bycatch fisheries out west. And I guess in terms of how selectivity plays into that, right? Like the distribution of the different age classes are really different across Alaska, just like they are coastwide. And so I think that the selectivity part of that is going to be really interesting in looking at those two different areas, especially with respect to the exploitation rate in the east. So that I would just throw my weight behind those two, if that's what we're doing here. And I guess along similar lines, Maya, I really like your, your graphic about thinking about the political boundaries versus biological boundaries. And I guess kind of a third, a third way of splitting that up would be based off of these kind of dominant fisheries and exploitation patterns across the coast. And that might get a little bit more at sort of what I'm hearing from a lot of people about these more like management issues. And I would need to think a little bit more about it, but it just occurred to me that some of them are matching up and maybe some of them aren't.
Thanks.
Yeah. And I love the color on the back of your wall.
Thank you. Looks like Sean maybe has.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Jane, you can put yours down.
So just thinking about, spatial structure and movement, and some of the things that we've learned through IPHC, for example, is basically the transmission of management choices across long distances. And then to what degree we're making management choices versus, I guess they're all management choices in the end. As I emphasized earlier, our big issue has to do with juvenile discarding. And so I can see that is one of those, things that could potentially translate across broad areas, especially because the juveniles are probably doing a lot of the moving, and they're the ones that are making the production. So anyway, so to what degree do you think, to me, that's the key issue here? Not just for personal reasons, just for scientific reasons. So to what degree do you think you'll be able to capture that? The juvenile, whatever, I guess. For BC, it's going to be, you have to model sublegal discarding, which is totally unregulated, so it's not, we model it as a byproduct of fishing. So it's kind of related to the quota that a given fleet is chasing. And it hasn't totally burned us yet, but we're definitely trying to think of new ways of doing it for trawl, because the trawl fishery is not actually going after sablefish. So the juvenile discarding is actually a function of them fishing for other stuff. So how are you going to do this?
I know this is all really good question. Basically, the boundaries that I'm working with is that I'm planning to model discard, retention curves for these fleets. And the question I have and don't know the answer to yet is basically how the outcome of Luke's work, which is those proportions, is going to translate into actual transit of biomass among regions. So something that's interesting that I sort of glossed over in this slide is that he actually did that movement analysis with respect to length, which then we translate into age. And so it either will be illustrative if we see that there is, it either will be illustrative or my fear is that there will be a lot of confounding between that discard mortality and the movement of small fish out of BC. The model might not be able to tell the difference between whether those fish are getting thrown out, meaning poorly estimating that retention curve, or if they are moving away at a young age. So off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that yet. I think doing kind of some sensitivity iterations where various things are fixed and seeing where the model wants to go could be helpful, but I think you mentioned in your talk that it's about a third of the recruitment is getting thrown out in discard on an annual basis. Correct me if that's off. Yeah,
pretty close.
Yeah.
Recently, there were a couple of years when it was lower, but recently they can't really avoid them.
Yeah. So suggestions welcome, but I really think that that's kind of nestled within this recruitment, movement, retention question.
Yeah, I guess it was more related to, so you have a retention curve, but that retention curve is applied to a catch, and the only way to generate catch is through the F. So the F is derived, depending on how you do it in the model, like if you give the fishery a quota and then figure out what the F is, then that's what I mean. Like that's a target, that's an F that's targeted on sablefish. And so they catch a whole blob of sablefish and they size distribution, and then they discard what they discard. And that works for us actually, for our trap and our longline fisheries, because they're pretty good that they're fairly tight to that. But for trawl, it's
because it's non-targeting.
Yeah, because the F is actually the F is going on after something else. So there's a mismatch there in, they're out fishing for other stuff and catching an amount of juveniles that is way out of proportion with their quota, with their legal size quota, just because, it's an interception. Which I assume there's quite a bit of.
Yeah, I'll have to think a little more about this. And candidly, I think this bleeds a little more into the management procedure aspect.
Well, I kind of was going to leave it till tomorrow, but I thought, well, it is kind of related, because the issue of the transmission of management choices is really the core.
Yeah. And I guess bigger picture where I'm coming from is, again, this is our first cut. So in the simplest sense, and please correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that when you guys go out and get your F from your management procedure or your TAC, you maybe aren't necessarily looking at the age structure presently and guessing how much they're going to discard this year. And I'm guessing. I could be wrong about that.
Well, yeah, in the management procedure thing, it's hard to say because the procedure is tuned to an operating model that's going to do all of that.
Okay.
And it, indirectly does, but yeah, I'm just thinking in the operating model, but I certainly wouldn't recommend trying to embed that in a management procedure. That was my advice in our last meeting. Was
it's true.
Simple
was don't do this.
Anyway, we can talk about that.
Yeah, we can talk more tomorrow or offline, and I guess I would just leave it at there's very likely going to be quirks of each management procedure that are currently done in each region that are not captured in this first phase. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
We are coming to the end of this discussion, and hopefully I see a few hands raised. If you could jot it down, and I mean, if there's any, hopefully it's relevant to tomorrow's discussion. We are going to be talking about all of this in breakout groups, and so we can definitely capture. So just hold on to your question. I appreciate it. And we just need to give a brief summary of kind of what we've heard and then move on to wrap up so we can be done by 5. Melissa, and a lot of things have been brought up that we have captured that we know that aren't going to be, that can be looked at in the future. And you've brought up things that are important to you. Melissa or Carrie, would you like to say anything more specific?
I think I can just offer a big picture summary of some take-home points from this discussion, which is that we hear you all that discards are an issue for all regions loud and clear. And we will, as we move forward, certainly discuss how to account for discards both in the operating model and in the estimation models that we set up. And so that will be an ongoing discussion, and we'll be able to capture this hopefully in more detail tomorrow. I also hear folks discussing the desire for further spatial resolution within the current regions that we've set up, which are essentially a function of the current assessment frameworks and the biology. That will be something that won't likely be addressed in phase 1. We hear the need, we hear the desire, and we'll have a discussion of this in the report so that we can capture it as a future work item, and we'll touch base with folks on that as we move forward as well. I think those are probably my top 2 take-home points, in addition to just, really thinking carefully about how we focus this first attempt at this work so that we capture the big picture reasonably with the understanding that, there will be hopefully room for refinement as we move forward, particularly if there's desire and resources behind this effort.
Sorry, do you have anything to add? We're getting some comments. We're getting some comments over here. So anyway, go ahead, Carrie.
Yeah, I actually was going to say the same thing. I don't have anything to add to Melissa's summary. I am noting that we have questions that have come in via the chat box that will be recorded. And I think maybe we could, I haven't had a chance to read them, but bring them up in a relevant discussion session tomorrow, if applicable, I think is a chance to not let these questions fall by the wayside. So.
I agree. I got a list of the chat box from Alex and Michelle. I just put them in my notes for us to see where they will go tomorrow. So thank you. All right. So thank you, everybody, for that discussion. We are going to take a few minutes just to wrap up. Oh, let's see. Where are we? Okay. So today, let's see. So again, actually, I'm just going to talk. I'm not going to do this thing. I'm just going to recap the day of what we've done. And we've talked about how we've gotten here, who's here while we're here. We've gotten to hear information about management strategy evaluation, the BC experience, which is very informative, their lessons learned, and then obviously what we just talked about, the focus and structure of this OM operating model, and where we're things that we can look at and things that we cannot at this time. And we did capture all of that. Is there any other comments? Or because one of the things we are going to ask is so tomorrow we are going to be going into the 3 breakout groups, and we'll describe how that's going to go more tomorrow. But we are going to have a breakout group for the objectives, the performance metrics, and the management procedures. Sorry, it's about 8 o'clock over here. I'm sorry. Anyway, so we're going to go through breakout groups and everything. And so tonight there's been a lot of information. And so really think about, like, what do you want? What do you care about? When we're talking about, is it the minimizing risk, the maximum, or have a maximum catch, or is there, what's most important to you? And then also thinking about how is that going to be achieved? How are we going to measure it? Is it going to be mean catch over so many years? Or, really start thinking about that, about what's really important to you, because that's what we're going to go into tomorrow and prioritize those and have a group discussion around it. And actually, so does that sound like a reasonable process? Chris, you can go ahead. Does that seem like a reasonable process, going in these breakout groups and getting all the feedback and having these discussions to provide feedback in this process? Great. I like that. I like seeing that. And also, if you could, in the chat box, go ahead and chat, like, what most interests you about tomorrow? Actually. If you could go ahead and do that, because then everybody will have an opportunity. We can just read them off as we go. Or you can talk about it for a second. Learning from those who are more experienced in this topic. Looking forward to even more conversation tomorrow. Is there any particular breakout group that you're most interested in? Interacting with people from other regions, all topics, but performance metrics and how it changes what we think we are going to do. Thanks, Andre. Opportunity to hear ideas, experiences, the process of determining objectives. That'll be interesting. Similarities and differences in objectives among regions. This is really helpful for us to see. Thank you, everyone. Priorities for phase 2. Yes, I hear you, Michelle, and how to get there from here. That's great. Okay. Well, we did capture everything today. Thank you all for being here. Thank everyone for being here. We will see you back at 9:30 in the morning. Do any of you leads have anything else to say to end the day?
Just thanks again to everyone for making time and for participating in this. It's great to have everyone across all these regions together with probably the biggest sablefish data set we've compiled in decades or ever. So it's great to have a team here.
Thanks, Sandra. 8:30 Alaska time. Yeah, all times. So 9:30 Pacific. anybody's joining from the East Coast, that'll be 12:30. But yeah, get some rest, take good care of yourselves, and we'll see you back in the morning. And if the team could stay on for just a second, that'd be great.
Is that just the main leads, or do you want breakout group facilitators?
Oh, yeah. No, just the